Good morning, everyone. I am here today with Mike Kunkel, who is VP of Sales Effectiveness Services for Sparks IQ. We are going to be talking about the building blocks of sales enablement. This is the fourth in our four-part series that is about critical actions to take to make your number in the new normal. A couple of housekeeping points before we get started, and I'll turn it to Mike. We would normally be either sitting across from one another, or Mike and I might be in the same room on a stage together presenting this material, and we could see your faces, see your hands if you had a question. Unfortunately, we're virtual, or for some folks, it's fortunate. And so what I'd like to say is the chat function, I will be monitoring it. If you have a question, please do share. And the slides will be made available after this session. As I said, this is the fourth of our four-part series, and we did that by design. One of the things that you'll hear in Mike's presentation, I've actually had the privilege of hearing Mike several times. He is really, probably in my mind, the most definitive expert, I think, both on sales transformation, but sales enablement. And the enablement part is critical because it pulls together all of the different aspects from an integration perspective that really allow you to scale your business and hit your numbers. So the first one I did in partnership with Steve Grossman, which was around talent. And, that is an important, we believe talent and how you reward them is critical to drive your business, probably the most important aspect of your business, getting the right people in the right role. Then we moved on with Harry Dunklin and Blythe Kazmersak to talk about pipeline and what we call the fidelity of the pipeline, which really is the way that a sales leader can run his or her business. Then we moved with Karen Douglas to talk about leadership and the role particularly of coaching and how coaching can really help you drive your sales performance, and really the current state of how it's not as effective as it could be because it's informal and erratic. And now we're tying it all up with Mike, and he'll bring together these various components. And as I said, I think his building blocks model is probably the best that I've seen. What we all have in common is we're here to give you, it's been designed with you in mind, which is pragmatic advice that you can take back. And what I used to say is change, something this afternoon that you're doing. They're all steeped in evidence, meaning evidence-based. We want to see, evidence that these practices are working. And then they're rooted in behavior. How can you shift a person's behavior to drive greater productivity? So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it to you. And again, if you have a question, please use the chat. Mike?
Hey, thank you, Tracy, and hello, everyone. I'm incredibly impressed with this series. The stuff that Tracy just talked about and what they've shared previously is exactly the right stuff to be thinking about at this point, especially in our current circumstance, but almost any time to really retool your sales force to get it to perform at its highest possible level. So I'm really pleased to be here and to be chatting about the enablement piece of this. There's one thing that before we dive into the current state of sales enablement, and I want to share multiple perspectives on that and then share the frameworks and building blocks that I've put together. I just want to warn you in advance that this is a little like eating an elephant. So I'm going to share a ton of information today that I think that will be helpful. There are frameworks, there are building blocks, there's systems thinking. I've got a big appendix for you at the end that when you get the slides, you'll be able to dig into on your own to go even deeper into the systems thinking piece, since there's only so much time here today. But I believe that you can take this information and do exactly what Tracy said. You can start to create actionable plans to improve sales performance, bringing all of these elements together. So with that said, let's look at the current state of sales enablement from multiple perspectives. Now, don't fear, I'm not going to read this slide to you, but just look at this for a second. We have definitions here on sales enablement, as I call it, undefined, by CSO Insight, Serious Decisions, Forrester, Gartner, Topo, IDC, Aberdeen, and I've left a couple of sales analysts off this list because I just run out of space. Now, if you think about how things have changed since these definitions first came out, CSO Insights is now owned by Korn Ferry. I don't know where their sales enablement analytics practice will head. Serious Decisions and Forrester are now combined, and they're extolling the virtues of revenue enablement, spanning across marketing and sales enablement and customer success or customer service as the customer facing or revenue generating functions. Gartner and Topo are now combined. Their definitions seem to remain the same, and IDC and Aberdeen are sort of idling there. So it's an interesting space right now, and it is evolving in a moving target. If you look at all the definitions, though, and we'll look at a few others in a second, there are some common themes, and that's what's going to lead us to the building blocks. There is one other factor that creates some further complexity, though, I mean, all these things spinning about sales enablement. I call it the bricks in the wall with a nod toward Pink Floyd. This is really the cross-functional collaboration element that's necessary in sales enablement to truly impact sales performance. And not every company has each one of these departments or functions, but the things that are done within them are done in almost every company. And sales enablers have to work across these different areas. Sometimes they come into sales enablement from marketing. Sometimes they come in from sales or sales management. Sometimes someone will come in through the training door, and they're not an expert in every single one of these disciplines, yet they have to cross-functionally collaborate with them to support the sales force in most effectively supporting the customers in the buying journey and the buying experience and sales effectiveness. So there's a lot of complexity here that we're going to try to unpack. There's a Sales Enablement Society. By the way, it's free to join at that link below. No cost yet for the society. It's a 100% volunteer organization. They have their definition of sales enablement: engaging buyers, right time and right place, assets, well-trained people, world-class experience, buyer's journey, maximizing and optimizing the selling motion with right sales and performance management technologies. It's a mouthful, right, as you look at this. But this is a very broad definition that covers a lot of aspects of it. ATD, the Association for Talent Development. As I speak right now, ATD Sell, their annual conference dedicated to sales enablement, is going on, and I'm speaking there, and I'm running a session this afternoon. ATD defines it a certain way, and they include talent selection and talent development, incentive and compensation design. You don't always see that, and it all ties into their world-class sales competency model. So ATD has a definition. Santucci and Lambert, who actually founded the Sales Enablement Society and are recognized experts in the field, and a fellow PE private equity guru, Kunal Mehta, are working together, redefining things today as commercial enablement and focusing on being a strategic orchestrator. And they're a fan of the commercial ratio, which I think makes a lot of sense in the PE world, maybe not as much sense in every case. But if you'd like to dive into that, there's more information and links there that you can access from the recording. But are you getting the point here about sales enablement undefined? So I tend to try to look at things then rather through this maturity model lens. So let's take a look at that. The first maturity model is what I see far too often: none. There's no sales enablement really happening. The concept is leave them alone and let them sell, as my boss says, right? There's no effort, no impact on sales performance. The second is random, and I think there are probably far too many here. This is very reactive, firefighting, distracted by bright, shiny objects. It's unlikely to impact sales performance, and everything is done randomly, often as a result of what I call the master of disaster, which is the loudest executive who's upset about the last thing that went wrong, right? And so, that constantly steers things in different directions, sort of on knee-jerk reactions. Not that any of us have ever seen that. Then there's informal level. This is starting to move toward more of a formal structure. It's not necessarily fully strategic, systemic, or scalable. Still somewhat reactive, partly data-driven. There's some impact here on sales performance, but it's not really maximizing the sales organization. This is where the magic starts to happen at formal. This is, for me, the sales enablement building blocks that I'll share in a moment with a charter, an aligned charter across these cross-functionally collaborating functions. It's supported by systems thinking, which, again, in the appendix, I'll go into in detail for you, just not verbally today. This is strategic, it's structured, it's systemic, it's scalable, it's measurable, it's driven by data, and this is where you can start to have a significant impact on sales performance. There's actually a level above that called adaptive or sometimes dynamic. That's sort of the above formal foundation plus performance consulting practices. If you're not familiar with performance consulting, Google or Bing or whatever search engine you use, search that down, take a look at it. There are a couple of great books on the market about it. It's sometimes referred to by geeks like me as HPT, or Human Performance Technology. But it takes sales enablement that's typically done to a new level of almost internal consulting. This is where I really like to get organizations, but I'm always really happy when they get to formal. And here's why. Here's a study done by CSO Insights showing the impact of formal and formal enablement with a charter on win rates and quota attainment. And you can see by the numbers, right, that there absolutely is an impact of sales enablement done well. There's another piece of this study showing that when you dynamically align sales process to the customer's path, in other words, aligning the selling and buying processes, right, becoming really buyer-centric, as I call it, you can see the impact on win rates and quota attainment there as well. And a separate study by Sales Enablement Pro on the state of sales enablement also showed significant impacts to win rates and quota attainment for formal sales enablement with the charter. So it's been proven out, folks. It's not a myth. It's just not always done the way that we'll get the results that we want. My advice
Mike?
is, yes.
I wanted to say, sorry to interrupt, this is so good, but here's a question. So is there a minimum number of sales, like, I guess the question is, how big does your sales organization have to be to start to think about sales enablement as a function?
Yeah, as a function, I would say, you start to get to, 25 people, or you start to get to what you perceive is going to be a fairly steady growth curve. You want to start to get something formal put in place. Now, you can cross-functionally collaborate and have a sales leader do that, or the CEO do that, or a COO do that across functions to support a sales force of a startup, for example. And you also want to make sure you hire incredibly well in those early days. So I'm a strong advocate of validated psychometric competency-based assessments to help you get the right people in place, because you'll be enabling them less in the early modes. But when you start to see the growth curve coming, or you get to that 25, 50 level, it makes sense to get at least a sales enablement leader in place, or a solid practitioner. And then as the organization grows and scales, you grow and scale accordingly. So I don't have other specific numbers. That's a great question though. And if so, you want to reach out to me separately online, we can probably dig into more of that. I know that there is some research out there on that. Hopefully that helps. Tracy, okay to move on?
Yep, that's good, thanks.
You bet. So look, my advice is to obviously to get the formal as fast as you can, even if it's small, right? But have a formal, strategic, structured approach, and then try to evolve to adaptive over time. So let's look at these building blocks that I've been leading toward here, which is a formal approach, and for me, supported by systems and systems thinking, which really is what starts to make it scalable. Let's look at the blocks. The first three, and I'll do these in sets of three from the top down. I like to start by focusing on the market and the buyers. Understanding your buyers, your buyer personas, the people who buy what you sell, is a critical piece of sales enablement. I use the phrase coin op, but there are others, right? But what are the challenges or opportunities your buyers are facing? What are the impacts of solving them or not capitalizing on the opportunity. What are the needs that those create for the organization? What are the outcomes that they're hoping to achieve, and how would they prioritize those needs and outcomes? If you start to understand that and understand the market and those people, then you can understand how to approach them and sell to them more effectively. Then it's a matter of creating buyer engagement content. And one of the things we say a lot, we toss the word content around a lot in sales enablement. And I'm an advocate of stopping saying just content and being more specific. Buyer engagement content's the collateral that you would share with buyers to interest them in the beginning, to get them into a sales process and buying process, and then the collateral that you would share with each persona in each stage of their buying process to help them feel comfortable moving forward to the next stage with you. And technically, in Six Sigma terms, for geeks like me, that's buying process exit criteria. What does each buyer, each decision maker need to see, hear, feel, understand, and believe in each stage to feel comfortable moving forward to the next stage with you? Buyer engagement content gets you there. And then sales support content is the collateral that you put together to help the sellers approach the market effectively. Then, of course, there's talent selection, sales training, and sales coaching. I don't know that I need to expound a lot there, but you've got to get the right people in the right seats on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, right, in the words of Jim Collins, right, and make sure that you are able to understand the talent and know what they need, each of them, to maximize the sales results that you want. And then you need to train them and coach them effectively. And I'm amazed in the sales profession how we compare ourselves to sports constantly, yet there's such a lack and dearth of coaching, that when in coaching, by the way, isn't just the manager firing off feedback and giving orders to their rep. It's a real process that you go through, and it's a developmental process. And so coaching is shown to have a phenomenal impact on sales results, yet we tend to overburden our frontline sales managers, not prepare them to coach effectively, nor give them time to do it. So it's a critical building block here, the right people, training them well, coaching them well. Next up is process methodology and the sales analytics and metrics that help you understand how those are going. Sales process, I probably don't need to speak to a whole lot, but it's basically the stages that the sale moves through. On a larger scale, I tend to think customer life cycle. What's happening with the customers before they get into a buying process? What's happening to them after the buying process? And how do you help your reps know where they are when they're talking to them and then adapt accordingly? But you do need to understand your sales process. There are stages of the process. There are objectives for each stage. There are tasks to be performed in each stage. And even for the sellers, there are exit criteria. Then, of course, under buyer acumen, you'd know their buying process and you'd align your sales process to their buying process. Sales methodology then is how the reps are selling, or the buyer-facing sales tasks in their sales process. Right? So the way that they're selling. And, we talk about methodologies all the time, and I won't toss names around, but most of the ones on the market today are not a full sales methodology that cover everything from the customer doesn't know who you are in lead generation to create opportunities, then managing those opportunities through the pipeline, and then doing strategic account management or key account management once their accounts internally to determine what's the right account objective for that account. Can you grow it? Are you just going to maintain it? You need to recover because they're not giving you as much business. What's your strategic objective for the account? And then what's the plan to achieve that objective? All right, so engage, win, and grow, as some of my friends say. And then there's the sales analytics and metrics. What are you measuring? What are the KPIs that matter? Are you a sales velocity fan? What matters in your organization? What are all the metrics, and how are you doing that? Last in in this section of the blocks, then there's the sales technology and tools that support the sales force in going to market. This would include, but not be limited to, of course, CRM, but there are sales engagement tools to help engage buyers up front. There are sales readiness and enablement tools that you can use to train and coach your sales force, especially now virtually, right? So whatever the tools are that the organization uses or should be using to help the sales force go to market with their buyers most effectively. Then there's compensation and recognition rewards, things that often aren't considered under the umbrella solely of sales enablement, but again, not everything in sales enablement is always owned by the sales enablement team or function. Remember, there's cross-functional collaboration, but if you're going to move the needle, having the right sales comp plan and recognition stuff in place is important. And then there's a box over on the bottom right that ought to be 17 times bigger, which is sales manager enablement. And I have other systems that that actually spin out from there, and sales management operating systems, et cetera. But you have to also focus on enabling your frontline sales managers. They are the force multipliers for change in your organization. And you can invest in them and see returns through each of their sales reps or their teams. So how are you preparing and enabling the managers in the same way that you're doing all of these things for the reps? And there are other systems for that. And then there's this systems thinking thing that that I talk about in ways that you can get these things moving in your organization in a system that's repeatable, scalable, and that will get results for you. And tied together with communication, which means two things, right? One is sales enablement being a single point of contact to the sales force through which others communicate in the organization, rather than messages from everywhere flying at the sales force at any time, any which way, which always creates this jumble of confusion. But by creating a regular recurring pattern or cadence of communication that is formatted in the same way and stored in the same place and searchable, you can really create a much better communication vehicle with your sales force. And sales enablement teams, I see more and more sales enablement leaders doing this so that the organization communicates to sales much more effectively. And then there's the cross-functional collaboration piece. So it's good communication, not just with the sales force, but with all of the other stakeholders and players who are supporting the sales force and organization or supporting the customers that they serve. And then remember, there's a bonus section in the appendix for you on systems thinking and how that applies. So I won't have time to go into all of that today. Now, here's an optional thing that I've seen some organizations do. This is typically a little bit larger, but sometimes I'll see some of these done in smaller organizations depending upon circumstances. This is sales support services. And often it's done via a service level agreement between sales enablement or whoever's providing the service in the sales organization. But it might be creating buyer and customer facing presentations, taking all of the umpteen decks that you probably have about things that you do, and then creating a custom presentation, whether it's a custom discovery approach or whether it's a custom product solution discussion, right? Helping the sales force pull those things together. It might be account or contact research and prospecting prep, or prep services for meetings. Sometimes industries where there's a lot of RFPs or requests for information, there are people who organize to do that so the sellers can sell. It could be a deal desk, a few strategic people who meet periodically where salespeople can bring larger or difficult or strategic deals to that we absolutely want to win, and talk about the strategies involved and get expert advice. Could be coaching services. I would prefer coaching for the managers rather than other people directly coaching reps. But again, in smaller organizations, sometimes you do what's necessary, right? And it could be other things as well. Whatever you would want to support the sales force on with some sort of overlay expertise can be part of sales support services. Many companies don't do this, don't have the budget for it, don't have the manpower, some don't have the need, but I've seen some do it with a high degree of success. So it is possible. And then these sales enablement building blocks with support services sort of sits like this, because I love to make diagrams. So those are the building blocks. I hope that makes sense. I won't cover this eye chart with you now either, but I wanted to include it so you have at least a little bit more detail on some of the thinking behind each one of the building blocks. The thing I will point out at the bottom again in the note, not all of these are owned by sales enablement. Some are owned by other functions. All of that is varies greatly by organization size or complexity. Sometimes it's based on whether the functions exist. Not every company has both sales ops and sales enablement and sales training, for example, right? So it's based on what exists in the organization. If a block isn't owned by sales enablement, the biggest message is enablers should have at least influence and input and involvement and foster that cross-functional collaboration, since all of these blocks do impact sales performance. So that's a little bit more about it. Now, the question I don't, yes, Tracy.
Yeah, before you move on, here's a question. If you could go back to your building block slide, I think this is a really good question.
Sure.
So there's two. One is I'm a private equity. This is from an executive. He's a partner.
Mm-hmm.
And what the question is do you recommend having like the human capital partner, or it's like an assignment of the sales enablement responsibility to one of the partners in the private equity firm, versus your point about kind of cross-functional? Like, I guess the question behind it is who would own that particular, the sales enablement responsibility? Does it matter, who that partner is, or is it just that it's important that somebody owns it?
So there's two levels to that question. I want to make sure I'm answering the right one. So for a PE company, I think somebody at the PE company should own whatever you call it: sales excellence, sales enablement, sales effectiveness across the portfolio companies. And I can think of at least two private equity companies where I know the person running sales excellence or sales enablement across the portfolio companies. And that model seems to be working really well for them. Now, inside the company, inside the portfolio company, and this is so variable depending on their size, the number of sales reps, which was asked about earlier, but I think as soon as reasonable, where the investment makes sense, I do believe someone should be the sales enablement function leader inside the portfolio company. So I would spike him at both, and in the absence of being able to do it within a portfolio company, again, based on size, startup level, et cetera, I would definitely want to have someone inside my PE company who was the expert in sales effectiveness, sales optimization. I've heard so many names, right? But whatever it is, sales performance improvement inside the PE company. And I think that will get you, that would be move number one for me. Move number two would be, when appropriate, get someone designated to lead sales effectiveness or sales enablement inside the portfolio company. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. I know this person who asked this question, so yes.
Okay, awesome.
But yeah, so that's good. Thanks.
Sure. Was there another one, Tracy?
Yeah, here's another one. So you talk about sales technology and tools.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share some of your favorite tools? And this is for the company is like a mid growth in their growth curve. So they're kind of, not at the peak, but they're not just getting started. So any tools in particular that you think are must-haves is how I would read that question.
Yeah, so I hate to do this, right? But probably the most common answer to that question is it depends. I do have some personal favorite tools, but those personal favorite tools might not be the best fit for that particular company. I think the most important thing is to have a strategy for the tools, rather than what most organizations do is they gravitate toward the rep that calls them, or the bright shiny object, or some cool new idea, as opposed to having an overarching strategy for what are we trying to support the sales team in doing. So is it sales engagement, like Sales Loft or Vanilla Soft? you know, outreach. Those are, you know, some really excellent options for sales engagement software, all right, used up front in the prospecting, now sometimes in combination with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, right? So but which tool is absolutely right for that company? I would actually point you toward the folks at Vendor Neutral, vendorneutral.com. And one of the things that they do is rate and rank and publish information on each of or as many as possible of these massive number of sales enablement tools on the market, and help companies put the right ones in place for them based on what they're trying to accomplish. So that might be helpful. And sales enablement tools, man, there are so many, and they're all friends. But I would say one of my favorite sales readiness, sales enablement tools is a company that I worked with previously in my own consulting firm, and we work with at Sparks IQ now, and it's a Lego. And what I really like about a Lego is they cover everything from on a sales enablement, sales readiness space across what I refer to as my 5 stages of sales mastery and behavior change. You learn something, you have to do something purposeful to remember that something, whatever you learned. Then if it's skills-based, which it should be for sales training mostly, then you have an opportunity to practice that skill and gain some prowess with it. Then you need some guidance in applying that skill on the job with real customers. And then you need to get coached to mastery over time. And so that's another one. That's, you know, any of the sales enablement tools that aren't so niche focused that they only do one thing, but they do a broader array of things in sales enablement. You know, Big Tin Can is one of those. Calidus Cloud was, and SAP bought them up for that reason, right? Because they touch on so many feature sets across the tool band. And I'm really a big fan of the conversation intelligence tools, as the analysts are now calling the category. Is things like Gong, Chorus is one of my favorites. Refract is another one, and more come into the market every day. It's almost impossible to keep up. But Allego even has some aspects of conversation intelligence as well. And that's where calls get recorded and they were analyzed either en masse to try to find best practices across your sales force, or individually, so you can coach a particular rep. So I'm going to be a little wishy-washy on that one and say I think you need to figure out what you're trying to accomplish, and then, you know, specifically compare the tools. G2 Crowd and Capterra or sites that you know, you can explore the tools. And again, I'm a big fan of what Vendor Neutral does in terms of helping buyers make the right decisions. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, and for as I said at the beginning, I mean, as you can hear in Mike, I mean, he's just such a wealth of knowledge on this. So maybe what I'll do for folks on the webinar, as well as others I think who would be interested, is maybe I'll just do a summary of, you know, some of these thoughts that you have for people with the links, because I think, to your point, it really depends on what you need and where you are in your growth trajectory.
Yeah, that's probably better said. But yes, exactly.
Okay, no more questions right now. Thanks.
All right. Yep, you bet. All right. So the question I do often get at this point, and people sometimes at this point are tilting their head like my dog does to one side, right? Like, okay, so that's neat, Mike. How do I actually get started with all of this? And I don't know if you've ever heard the old joke. I was a musician in my early days when I was thin and had hair. And the joke was, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer was practice, 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 right? But mine's a little different here. So, you know, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Martha says, well, that depends, Bob. Where are you now? And that's really the starting point for how do you get started. So a charter is almost always my first recommendation. And a charter is really just about establishing how you are defining sales enablement for your organization or your portfolio companies, getting clarity about what it means, why are you doing it, what will you be doing, who's going to be working together and collaborating to do it, how is that work going to be done, to what level, right? It's about establishing priorities, getting clarity, setting expectations, and creating plans. When this isn't done, right, you are far more susceptible to those knee-jerk reactions and the master of disaster that I mentioned earlier. So, you know, I would get together and do your best, spend some energy here to find which building blocks will you support? Which building blocks are you supporting in some way today, and to what level? Which ones do you want to prioritize to put in place next? And then really think about who's going to need to work together to do that effectively to support the sales force in supporting your buyers. Right? And so it's really that, right? Which are the building blocks? How will you sew them together with systems thinking? Again, appendix. What level, if any, of the sales support services will you provide, and what will sales enablement mean to you? That allows you to do the good old current state, desired future state analysis with a gap analysis. What's the difference? What will it take to bridge the gap? And what's the impact that we can get if we make that happen, which really allows you to start to build the plan. And this is how you eat the elephant, right? Because when you start to think about all of these moving parts in the building blocks, it's very easy just to let your eyes roll up into the back of your head and walk away. The key is to do the analysis to figure out what have you got in place, where are the biggest gaps, which are the things that would best help the reps support the buying process, right? Teaching reps to sell the way buyers want to buy, and then starting to put those pieces in place one piece at a time. Phase one, phase two, phase three, phase four. I have seen the entire building blocks be put into place in a what I would call a good enough for now framework, unbelievably in 6 months. I've also seen it done over a period of 18 months. And if you think about the time that it actually takes, if you really want to do it well, and you're talking about culture change, if you want to drive and implement a sales methodology effectively, in a large enough organization, 50, 100, 500 sales reps, you're talking about an 18 to 36 month journey. Very few people want to hear me say that out loud, but it's true, right? And it takes that kind of staying power to drive significant change in 2x, 3x, 4x revenue in an organization, unless they happen to be a startup with this product that no one will live without, and the product itself drives, right, that kind of revenue or that kind of growth. But I think we all know that that the unicorns are somewhat rare, right? And it's really a mix of, Kurt Lewin years ago said behavior is a function of the person and the environment. If we think about that today, it's the nature nurture argument. If you get the right people in the right seats on the bus and you create the right environment in which average people can perform at above average levels, that's what these building blocks are really about. It's how do you take the good people that you put in place and support them in a way that will allow them to produce radically better results for you. And again, it's not going to happen overnight, right? That's the magical thinking that sometimes I see senior sales leaders succumb to, is they it's just like when they train a sales force, we used to put them in a big room or a series of rooms and do this rollout, and it was like, okay, now we can expect a 30% increase. And I would always laugh to myself and say, what are you taking? Is it mushrooms? And it's the sustainment, it's the coaching, it's the coaching the coaches, it's putting these kind of building blocks in place and creating the machine that allows you to get those repeatable, replicable results and drive growth. So doing this in bits and pieces, figuring out where you are, figuring out the gaps, that's the plan forward that I always recommend. So that's the bulk of the content. I'm going to come back to this question slide in a second. I just want to show you that in the appendix, there's this whole thing on systems thinking. right? And this was the one I wanted to get to, right? There are systems that support these building blocks: sales hiring system, sales readiness and training, which is a subset of readiness, a sales management system with a sales management operating system. And these aren't the only systems, right? But these are the four that I've used to support the building blocks to radically drive change in results. So I just wanted to let you know that that stuff is sitting in there. And I think that it can be are really helpful for you. Maybe it's something that we get together and we talk about at some future date. But that's the building blocks. And as they say, that's my story and I'm sticking to it, Tracy. What other questions do we have? Has anything come in?
Let me look. No, there's no more questions, Mike. But I would love to take you up on your offer to have, a follow-on conversation to this, because there's so much information in here, and we could, unpack each of these system syncing conversations
Yep.
For folks. I think that would be, in and of itself, an entire series. But let me just look here. Nope, no more questions at this point.
Okay.
I just really would love to appreciate you here. I think that what we have is just, as I said at the beginning, a great just how-to guide to get started with lots of information. And I think the key, and you've heard this throughout the entire series, is really a systematic approach with metrics. And I think Mike has really outlined and brought it all together, the importance of all these different components coming together. And I think if you look at this, it could be easy to just, to your point, think, where do I get started? And I think that the point is just getting started. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Mike? It's the most important thing to kind of think about where you are today and where you want to be. It's, it's only too late if you don't start today, is what I'm thinking of.
It reminds me of that quote, right? The longest journey begins with the first step, right? So that's exactly right. Don't let the elephant overwhelm you, right? You just, slice it up and take it one bite at a time.
Yep. And I know Mike here's his LinkedIn profile. Definitely reach out to him. He's very generous with sharing his ideas. And I'd like to appreciate you and those on the call. And the slides will be made available, as will be recording. And we also post the recording itself on the Growth Flight Charlie YouTube channel. With that, I think we can call it a wrap.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. And Tracy, thanks so much for inviting me. This is always fun stuff for me to talk about, and I hope it's been helpful, folks.
Thank you.